Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Mara Gladstone, Associate Curator at the Palm Springs Art Museum. It's really great to see you here, and it is an incredible honor and a pleasure to introduce you to Steve McCurry, who has been an important voice in photography for more than 30 years. I know you've been working for maybe more than 40 years at this point. His images from across the globe have been published in countless magazines, books, and exhibitions. His career launched into public renown when he emerged in Afghanistan in the late 1970s with rolls of film sewn into his clothes and created some of the most iconic images of the Soviet-Afghan war that we know. Since then, McCurry has photographed sites of conflict on almost every inhabited continent, burning oil fields, refugee camps, ship-breaking yards, monsoons, and myriad natural disasters. A member of Magnum Photos since 1986, many of his images have become modern icons, which is something a lot of artists would only treasure the opportunity to be able to say that they've created, including the image of Sharbat Bibi, otherwise known as the Afghan Girl, which appeared on the cover of National Geographic magazine in 1984. Through evocative color imagery, McCurry has spent his career taking pictures that seem to capture the essence of the human condition, from places as far as Lebanon and Cambodia to the Philippines, the Persian Gulf, the former Yugoslavia, Tibet, and of course here in the United States. So Steve, I'd love to start with some questions about your journey as a photographer. You started your career in the 1960s, which here in the United States was a time of social and political unrest, the context of sort of coming of age, the era of civil rights, the start of post-colonial movements across the globe, feminism, second wave feminism. And your first photographs in your new monograph, which was written by your sister, are of everyday people in your home state in Pennsylvania. They remind me so much of the social documentary photography of Walker Evans, Lewis Hine, Dorothea Lange. And I know you traveled all over the United States and I think Central America right out of college. And so what was your first journey abroad and what compelled you to do it again and again and again?
Well, after high school, I was kind of looking for something to do. I didn't know if I wanted to go to college. I was working in a mailroom, and just by chance, there were all these people from all over the world coming in. I was in the international division, and it really got me interested in places where I had really never even heard of, Turkey and Kenya and Europe, and people come from Hong Kong and different places. So I decided to spend a year in Europe. I went and lived in Europe for a year, washing dishes in a restaurant in Amsterdam and Stockholm. I worked in a kibbutz in Israel and went by road through Eastern Europe. And then I thought, you know what, I don't want to go back to washing dishes for the rest of my life. I better find something to do. So I went back to school, and I kind of took various courses in the university, and then I thought, I want to be a filmmaker. That's what I want. I want to make films. So I studied cinematography, and in the middle of that course, one of the requirements was a course in still photography. So I took that, and then once I kind of got immersed with the camera and walking around taking pictures, I thought, this is far more interesting than film, because it allowed me just to go off on my own. It was a very kind of solitary endeavor. I could literally walk out the door and shoot pictures of sort of serendipitous moments on the street. It didn't require a script. It didn't require pre-production, post-production. It was very inexpensive. I could just walk around with a small camera. And so the film making idea kind of went by the wayside, and I ended up getting a job on a newspaper. I actually looked for a job in film.
Well, that was the kind of like the auteur period too. I mean, you could actually just go and just make this filmic dream.
But unless you're going, unless you're a genius like Orson Welles, or you're on the going to UCLA and you're or in NYU. Uh, I was going to I was going to Penn State, which had no real great film, so I had no chance. In fact, going into so I worked on a newspaper, got very bored with that after 2 years, and decided that I wanted to travel. That was my main kind of ambition. And so I just quit the newspaper, went to India, and just wandered around for like 2 years. No assignments, nothing really substantial. And in the course of that kind of wandering, well, one of the key points of that trip, I'd say there's two. One was I was sick in bed with dysentery. Also, I had been bitten by or I'd come in contact with a rabid dog, which
Both.
I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't remember, if you broke the skin or whatever, but you don't want to mess around with that. So I was getting a series of rabies shots in my stomach while also having this amoebic dysentery. I got a book, Paul Theroux's book on the Great Railway Bazaar. Paul's right here in the front row. And it was so captivating, not only about the train. I had already spent kind of weeks on the train in India, going all over the country, and it was not only a great description of the Indian train journey, but also through Asia and China and back through Russia. So that experience was very pivotal, I think, in coming up with a story which would result in a magazine story and a book. And also, at the end of that 2 years, I was also living through two monsoons, and I thought this is an epic story. The monsoon, it's either flooding or it's drought, and most of the country depended on the monsoon, the agricultural part. And then, just by sheer coincidence, went into Afghanistan with a couple of refugees I met, and they said, "Oh, come, we got to show you this. What's happening in our country? Our villages are being destroyed. We need somebody to tell that story. And you're a photographer. We want you to come in and see for yourself, document it." So I did, and that was in June of 1979. I had all these pictures. I went back again. And then when the Soviets invaded, I had all these pictures, unpublished pictures. And New York Times started publishing those pictures from, on page 1 and page 3. And then the pictures exploded all over the world. The AP, Perry Match, Stern, literally most magazines were published. So I went from being this sort of, this gypsy kind of traveling around aimlessly in South Asia to having this sort of being thought of as sort of an Afghan expert, which I wasn't, but I was one of the only people that had gone in. So that was really my big break, I would say, which led to kind of opening the door to major magazines back when magazines were the main, one of the main ways to make a living in kind of documentary photography.
You seem to have a natural, you talk about this so easily as though it's just, you just got on a plane and just went. You seem to have a natural proclivity to being able to exist and be in all of these different cultures and places. Would you put on masks? Would you change yourself, or how would you position yourself when you were in these places and taking these photographs?
Well, when I was in Afghanistan, I dressed in the local shalwar kameez, and I dressed exactly the way they did, and I lived with them. We slept on the floor. We ate the same food, and I just became part of the group. They were very friendly, very hospitable. That was back when Westerners, when Americans were really highly regarded. Now, if I went, you'd be grabbed, and it would not end well. But no, I've always, I think, being kind of, I've always kind of blended in, kind of quiet, and obtrusive.
But it seems like there's a certain resilience that has to be there.
Well, I think there's a kind of there's a passion, there's a curiosity. I think there's have a certain drive, to kind of persistence. A lot of it's just sheer dogged persistence and not giving up.
You're a traveler in the spirit of the literary dreamer, the wanderer, the global citizen, from Mark Twain, Bill Bryson to Paul Theroux, who I know you're great friends with. And how has travel writing influenced you, whether as a reader of books or writer of diaries or postcards?
Just go back to that.
Yeah.
You know, when I remember going into these villages in Afghanistan, there was no television to speak of, there was no internet, no cell phones, and you would go into these villages, and there would be a pack of children which would kind of run after you, and then they, more kids would come, and pretty soon you're trying to be this sort of fly on the wall in the village, and you can't work because there's all these kids following you. So it became, but I found that the more you just kind of wait them out and just try and slow down, eventually the kids would end up, kind of starting to play among themselves. But it was a real problem.
It's kind of like when I get home from work and my kids are just on
Yeah.
top of me, and then you just
You're like a
after a little
Pied
bit you
Piper.
become part of the couch,
Yeah.
and then they're just
It's no, it was a real problem. But again, sometimes you just had to literally go somewhere else because there were just so many kids. Literally, you couldn't move. There were all these kids around you, and it would just shut you down. You couldn't move. I mean, you couldn't work.
Were you able to share any images that you were taking with people when you
No.
were taking them?
No, there was the digital
Not
didn't
possible.
exist. So you were just and everyone with their picture, the kids are jumping up, trying to get in your frame. Really, I mean, it was impossible, absolutely impossible. And then I remember on the train, if you didn't have a reservation, sometimes you'd have to, you're in the corridor of the train, and even if you had a seat, a second class, I was always in the second class compartment. You would during the day there'd all be people lined up on your seat, and you'd have to be very careful about your camera equipment. I know a couple. There's a very famous Eve Arnold, who was a Magnum photographer. She had all of her cameras stolen while she was asleep. Somebody came in and took everything. I had all my cameras stolen in Thailand. Somebody convinced me to. I wanted to go out to a refugee camp back in 1980 with all these Cambodians coming into Thailand, and this fellow convinced me to go out to his village, and while we were having lunch together, I thought this guy was going to, solve all my problems. He ran back to the hotel room, cleaned out everything. He left me the empty camera bag, but he stole all the equipment, everything. And when we sat down, he ordered all this food, and after like 20 minutes, I started to get nervous. Like, where did this guy go? He said I was going to go see a friend, and I thought, I went back to the room and it was clean, nothing. So I decided to. I had no cameras, and I didn't have any money. So I took the train. I got back on the train to go back to Bangkok, and it was an all-night train journey. And I was really depressed because suddenly I'm a photographer without any cameras. And so I'm walking out of the train station in Bangkok, and I saw the guy who stole my cameras. He had taken the same train too. So I saw him walking, his pockets were bulging with all those cameras and everything. So when I grabbed him and went to the police station, I got all my cameras. It was like a miracle.
Oh,
To
great.
get everything back.
Oh,
I mean, it was like, that was, the chance that happening were like, it was an impossibility. But I was very lucky.
Did it change how you took pictures or how you
Well,
dealt with
the
film?
lesson I learned from
Yeah.
that was, if you're ever going to work with a fixer or translator or an assistant, and I've never forgotten this, you have to know something about that individual. You have to know especially as a photographer, because I have all the equipment, and they have to be kind of recommended by a friend, or you have to know where they work, or you have to know something. This guy just happened to be on the street, and I trusted somebody, and it was turned out to be a disaster almost.
So, but it probably was going to happen at some point, and so.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No,
So,
no.
yeah.
Things are going to go south for sure.
Got it back, and then.
I mean, I was in a, I was in Slovenia, and I wanted to get some aerials of this particular region around Ljubljana, and I rented a small plane, like an ultralight, and we went around, flying around, and so I'm photographing this lake, Lake Bled, and suddenly the pilot decides to get really low to the surface of the water. In fact, he was so low, we were about that high off the water, and I said, go up. I said, if I want to be that low, I could shoot from a boat. I don't need to be in a plane. And no sooner was I was doing this to go up, the wheels got caught in the water, and it started to go down, and then the plane went forward, the propeller burst apart, and then suddenly all the water started, we flipped upside down, and then I was underwater. It was an open cockpit. I was underwater, and it was February. I was drowning, and I had the seatbelt around my waist and around my shoulders, and I had this helmet. And I thought, oh my God, I can't breathe. I'm going to die. I don't know how to get the seatbelt off. It was like a homemade plane, and I didn't know how the mechanism worked, and I'm upside down, and I just somehow, again, just by some fate, I was able to slide out from underneath the seatbelt, and I went under, and I was able to get out, and I never opened the seatbelt. It was loose enough I could go out from under it, and then the cameras were lost. I had $4,000 in cash, which I actually ended up. They got the plane out the next day, and my little fanny pack was still behind the seat with all this money and passport and everything.
So you have a lot of good luck. Your sister writes in your new monograph a lot about just the stress of wondering if you are still around and receiving regular dispatches and then not. And it sounds
they
like
called her on January 31st of like 1980, between 80 and 81. This is Steve's. We think Steve's missing in Afghanistan. Can you imagine the State Department calling your family and saying, "Well, we think your brother's, missing," and there's a report about somebody being killed, et cetera, et cetera. Have you heard from him? And of course, my sister was like freaking out because, they don't just call without some kind of, probably serious information. And it was another 2 weeks before I actually surfaced. Somehow the telex I had sent never was either sent or received. And so that happened a couple times. As in Afghanistan, where I went in and, I was there for a couple weeks and then presumed to be lost or killed or whatever.
I'd love to get a little into this idea of visual storytelling, and maybe I'll just start by asking a question about editing, because as a photographer, your early jobs, you were kind of tasked to go out and take pictures of current events, and then your images would be used to illustrate stories. And can you share with us what it's like to be edited? I mean, unlike an author of a novel where, yes, there's an editor. I mean, you send the pictures, you don't necessarily know what images are going to be selected. Did you develop strategies to guide your editors to pick pictures that you thought were the strongest, or did you think about, in the process of working with photo editors, is it more like a collaborative kind of authorship in how these pictures end up ultimately telling a story?
Well, it was a collaboration. Ultimately, the magazine's able to use what they want, how they want to use it. I mean, they pretty much do the layout and the selection, and you do have some input in the beginning, but as the process goes further down the road, you lose less and less control. But I think that's the case of, I mean, the only way to kind of, I mean, the best thing is just to do your own book, and then you can decide what you want in the book and how you want it laid out and which pictures you want to use and not use.
Yeah, so you have published a huge number of edited volumes exploring your incredible body of work. And so I'd love if you can talk a little bit about the affinities between literature and bookmaking and photography. I mean, so many photographers use the book format to tell specific stories. And how have you approached publishing your own books versus, say, thinking about magazines as a venue for your work?
Well, you know, for instance, I did a book on the monsoon back in like 1986, which was, again, that look at that weather phenomenon and how people deal with it, and whether it's flooding or drought. But I've done books on other subjects. We did a collaboration with Paul on reading people. I've been photographing, well, human activity. I have about 20 or 30 sort of themes that I, keep following away in the back of my brain, whether it's people working or playing or, spiritual endeavors or farming and, people reading and sleeping and different things. So I was actually looking through my work, and I was photographing people reading back when I worked on the newspaper in 1975. But again, it's something that, photograph schools and students and people on park benches and airports and whatnot. Inevitably, that's one of the things that people do, is they read, or they, I have a lot of pictures of people, reading and sleeping together. So, but it's no, it's so I did a book on coffee. I've done a couple books with kind of short stories. I did a book called Untold, about 15, I would say, short stories, a chapter per subject. So I've been doing about a book a year for the past, I guess, 15 years or 16 years, something like that.
And so that's that interest in the human condition, shared experiences across culture, and you became known for the work that you did in places of war and conflict. And in the last 10 or 20 years, you've really moved into being more of that global photographer. There's a lot of humor in the pictures we see. Can you talk about that shift for you as an artist?
Well, I was never really a war photographer. I went to, I was in Afghanistan, worked in Beirut. I was, a little bit of work in Sri Lanka and Kashmir, but I was never really like a combat photographer or going like a Robert Capa or, David Douglas Duncan. I was more, it was more, for me, more about the human consequence, the refugees and people caught in the middle. And the Gulf War, of course, was an epic situation. I mean, the environmental catastrophe was just, there was this 600 oil wells on fire, and it was going on for months. And but I would say 90% of my work has been more just cultural and, people in different places, kind of all doing the same thing, whether it's, kids playing soccer on the street or, just daily life.
Yeah. And since its inception, photography has had this incredible and unique ability to connect to the idea of truth, but it's also had a very fraught relationship to that. And, that what we see is what is, and yet we know it's kind of impossible for a single image to say everything. These compendiums, I think, of images kind of try to hint at certain shared truths we have about human existence, which I think is really beautiful. and yet certain images also have a kind of iconic power, like the image of Sharbat, which is very special. And I guess I'd like to touch, if we can touch on a little bit about the ethics of the photograph. And, you know, to be a good photographer, you kind of have to be an engaged observer. You have to be present and also invisible. There's always a question of looking versus acting when you see something that doesn't feel right or is unfortunate. And in the process of taking a picture, you're bearing witness, and you do have to have that burden.
Yeah, there was a situation just yesterday. Somebody was commenting on a picture of, I photographed this young boy in Afghanistan who happened to be guarding a street. He was like 14. He had this bullets around his neck, and he was this very sad-looking little guy. And somebody made a comment that, oh, you know, these photographers are profiting off of these, you know, these conflicts. And I was thinking, well, should we not go there and photograph it? Should we not report on places like Syria or whatever, and just ignore those places? I mean, somebody has to go. You can't fault the photographer for showing what's happening. And by the way, we happened to go back in 2016, and we met that little boy who now was like, I don't know, 35 or whatever, who had been in that picture. And he looked exactly the same. It was incredible. And he's a juice vendor now. He sells juice on the streets of Kabul. And it was an incredible story. I mean, we shot this kid, and it ended up on the cover of Newsweek. And I think it's really the strong picture. This little boy he's 14, but he looks about 50. This look of, you know, and to be able to be reunited with him was amazing, you know. But I think that it's important to show. Obviously, I mean, you have to report on these places and show what's happening. I mean, you can't, you know, ignore these places. And
I mean, you take beautiful pictures, though, and you show these places and these experiences, these people in very beautiful ways, and your images are very simply really stunning. But many photographers, from Edward Curtis onwards, you know, the idea of creating an aesthetically lovely image when documenting hardship or other people or other cultures, it's a creative decision that often brings criticism. Can we talk a little bit about this, about the potential for beauty to maybe offer a space of possibility, having a bigger conversation, and how you decided to make that move, you know, to really become a master of photography, and in the sense of using color and texture.
yeah. Yeah, color certainly sometimes makes things, you know, beautifies things, and certainly when the kind of light that you work in, again, it heightens the kind of, but I work in a certain kind of light, and for me that's what I like, and it feels right. And sometimes, I mean, I think the pictures I've made of the conflicts, say in the Gulf War or Afghanistan, I mean, I just photographed what was in front of me, and in the case of Iraq, it was stunningly, there was this kind of grotesque beauty, or this terrible beauty, that was just, you know, the color and the light. It was an incredible thing to witness, and I don't apologize for the way the pictures look. I think it was epic. It was biblical. It was like you're there and you think this looks like a giant movie set. I mean, it was literally something which I had never even imagined could be, and never seen anything since.
When truth seems so unbelievable.
It was,
Yeah.
the light was just, you know, unbelievable. I mean, which created this sort of beauty, despite the fact that there's people, you know, on the battlefield, dead bodies on the battlefield. Speak up. Okay.
Thanks. So this is a kind of big and maybe crazy question, but you have been probably to more places. You've seen more of the world than most anybody. How's it changed? How's it changed? I mean, you've traveled really everywhere repeatedly, and if you can't really get to how's it changed? How do you think being a traveler has changed?
Well, as I was saying earlier about in place like Nepal or India where I'd spent a lot of time, and there was no. I mean, now that there's the internet and cell phones and TV, uh, you're no longer this novelty. And a place like Afghanistan, where when I went there in the beginning, you're out of touch for weeks at a time. And now, I would say, the vast parts of Afghanistan are connected through cell towers. I mean, you can literally drive from Kabul to Mazar Sharif and to Bamiyan and into the Panjshir Valley, and you're connected almost the whole way. Same in Tibet. I remember being in Tibet 25 years ago, and there was all these kind of nomads, these really barely paved roads or dirt roads, and now the roads are all paved. There's cell phones everywhere. All the nomads have motorbikes. The Chinese have come in and built an entire town from scratch. The whole town was just made at one time, and it's completely changed in many ways. So, yeah, Cambodia, Angkor Wat, when I was there, was well, there was a lot of tourism maybe in the 50s and the 60s, but when I was there in the mid 80s, when the fighting with the Khmer Rouge, there was not even one tourist. It was completely empty. And now it's, just there's dozens of buses every day
Oh, Disneyland.
that go in, yeah.
Yeah.
It's, go to a place like Venice now, and you can't move. I mean, there's always been tourists in Venice and Rome, hundreds of years, but not like this. I mean, they'll have cruise ships, not just one, but there'll be, several at one time.
I think they're charging admission now, actually.
Well, there's a plan to do that. I don't think they've started it quite yet, but it's incredible. I mean, so and Rome and many places the same story. So I was in China in the mid '80s, and everybody was running around those Mao suits, and it was. Now it's you go to a place like Shanghai, and it just blows your mind. It makes New York look like a quaint village.
So the world's changed, and I think you had a big change recently. You mentioned to me you're a relatively new dad, and
We have a 2-year-old daughter, which is an amazing, life-changing.
how has that changed
But
your work?
I have to say it's changed in a wonderful way. I feel really lucky and blessed to have this little girl running around. She's, I learn more from her, I think, than, no, it's been amazing. And we actually taken her, when she was 4 months old, we took her to the Arctic on a cruise. And we've been to Easter Island, we've been to Burma twice, we've been to India, Bhutan, we've been all over Europe, and she's a great traveler. She's flying is fine, but we're going to continue to travel with her and show her the world. It's been amazing. Actually, Andy and I traveled quite a bit before we had Lucia, and then we're slowing up a bit with her because obviously, there's a limit to how much you can take a child around the world. But it's been great so far.
Has it changed how you take pictures or how you
No,
think about pictures?
Well, it's changed how I think about children. When I was coming here yesterday on the plane from New York, it's 5 hours plus, there was a screaming kid just like 2 rows back. And in the past, my, inclination would have been, oh my God, this kid, I can't believe I'm. Now I was thinking, I wanted to go back and sort of try and comfort that child. I mean, I wasn't fazed by this crying child. Plus, I had my earphones on, my Bose noise cancellation. But no, I wasn't at all, bothered by it, really. I mean, the way I maybe would have been before. So I think it's amazing. I'm really, we're having a great time with her.
Do you have a different sense of your own self-preservation if you're
Well,
going out in the field and taking
Oh
a
yeah,
picture?
well, there's things I would probably not do now that I may have done before. We're trying to, we got her a camera. We're trying to get her to. I would love to see her, take an interest in photography. Certainly, I think somewhere down the road, she'll inherit. She'll be, all my archive will probably be in her hands at some point down the road. So hopefully she can, learn to a little bit about.
Learn to be an active producer of visual culture, not just a passive consumer
Yeah.
on her phone. That would be great. I'm going to take this opportunity to open up to questions. Yes, and I'll repeat the question.
Have you had to use a release of your subjects?
The question is, has Steve had to use a release to photograph his subjects?
Well, I've never had anybody sign a model release, which means that the pictures can't be used for advertising or commercial reasons. No, I've never. I mean, to carry a pad around and have people sign. The problem is that the release has to be in their local language. If they sign in English, that doesn't. Plus, you also have to pay them. There has to be some kind of a payment. So if you has to be in their local language, and that they have to be able to read, it gets very complicated fast. And to go around and it would be really, that would lose. I think I would lose interest in the whole thing if I had to do that.
For you?
Did you make the switch from film to digital? And if you did, how was that experience for you? Are you shooting digitally now, or are you still shooting?
No, I shoot.
The question is Steve moved from a standard camera to digital formats?
Well, I use a digital camera now. The great thing about digital photography is you can shoot in much lower light. You don't need, in a room like this with fluorescent, you don't need to filter the lens the way you did with film. And again, the big advantage is real. And plus, you can also see the picture, and then you can decide, is it in focus? Is the composition what you thought it was? I remember shooting situations with film, and you think, man, this is a great shot. And you get back home like a month later, and you realize the entire shoot, they're all back focused, because I was focusing on the wall, and when I was taking a picture of you, but actually the focus was back, so the whole thing was spoiled. Happened more than once. I had friends who had a broken lens, and they thought they were at, say, f8, and they were actually at 1.8. The whole thing was ruined because they couldn't see the pictures. Whereas now with digital, you can actually monitor the thing and know if the pictures are good or not.
Yes.
Your pictures, your portraits are particularly strong. Do you ask the subjects to pose for you in the picture? For instance, the bandit, the little boy that was the guard with the bullets. Did you request him to stand in a particular place, or did you just come upon that by happenstance?
Yeah, I ask him to look into my lens. I ask him to look at me. I usually ask people to look at me. I don't really, I want to, if somebody's smiling and being a little kind of self-conscious, I try and get past that. I'm looking for more of a kind of a neutral expression. I don't want a big grin. I'd rather have just something more simple, more plain. So I don't really. That's what I don't really direct people to look sad or look happy or, I want something more.
You ask their permission, may I photograph you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, it's always. I mean, Many times people don't want to be photographed, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. That I could, there could be millions of reasons why they don't want to be photographed, and you have to honor that. I don't have but I try and just take. I mean, I think the key really is selecting the person who you think has the right face that tells the kind of story that you feel is some kind of universal archetype of something that has meaning to you. So, yeah, very little direction. It's more the light. The light is, I can't stress enough how important the quality of light is in a portrait or in a, and also just getting that. It's not that there's necessarily one moment, but I'm photographing a portrait. By talking to the person as you're shooting, you can elicit different kinds of expressions. And I don't want somebody just to have a kind of a frozen face. I want to be able to get some choice. So when I get back home, I can look through the group and find the one I feel really is the best. But by talking to people and asking them questions, and you can get different kind of expressions. But I don't say, can you laugh for me or can you cry for me or any of that. It's kind of a genuine.
In the back in black.
It's color is very tricky. You have to have the right. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking for the right color palette. There's not a lot you can do in post-production if the color is really off. I mean, you can darken it perhaps, but you really have to be searching for the right. I mean, I have the luxury of kind of going to the certain place and photographing in certain light, certain time of the day. And as I walk around, I'm constantly looking for all of these kind of variables to kind of come together and fall into place. But by underexposing slightly, making your pictures a little darker, it kind of creates richer colors. It's just simply a question of underexposing. The colors become more vibrant, more intense, just by shooting a half a stop or a full stop less.
Yes.
When you say that you have a specific time that you like to shoot, what is that time?
The question is, when is Steve's magic hour?
Well, I like to shoot in the early morning for natural light, and late in the afternoon. But during the middle of the day, say between 10 and 3, I'm usually inside someplace. Maybe it's a bazaar, maybe it's a school, maybe it's somebody's home, it's a shop, where the light is more even. So the magic hour thing doesn't really. I mean, I'm shooting all day long. It just, but I am taking advantage of that soft light. A portrait is much better in that soft light than say at noon. So but again, I'll shoot it in the morning till maybe 9:30 outside. Then I'll go inside and have lunch, 12 or 1, and then around 2 or 3 go back outside. Go inside. Sorry. And then at around 3 or so, go back on the street. It depends on, of course, where I'm shooting too. If I'm in a city with tall buildings, I'm able to work in the shadows. And maybe I can work all day in the shadows, But if I'm in a place where there's real, then it's much more difficult. You really have to. It's all. You have to kind of think about where and when to do your best work.
Well, thank you, Steve, for your really beautiful pictures.
Thank you.
Thank you.